Hi, I'm Megan. Welcome to today's live reading from The Victor by Nicole Flockton, presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Join me for Chapter 1. Ava Vaughan Jacobs smoothed down her emerald green dress and adjusted her diamond and emerald earrings. She probably shouldn't wear Cole's wedding gift when she was about to ask him for a divorce. Whether it was in bad taste or not, she had her own reasons for wearing them. Even though she wanted to end their marriage, the earrings had been given to her when a new chapter of her life had been starting. She hoped tonight would be a new start too. It seemed fitting to wear them. Would Cole notice the earrings or not? Would he wonder why she had them on? Remember when and where he'd given them to her? Stop it, she told herself. None of it mattered. All that mattered was when she returned to her room, she'd have Cole's agreement for a divorce. With one last look in the mirror, she picked up her purse and checked it for her phone and room key. She decided to stay at the hotel instead of driving the 3.5 hours it would take to get back to the house in Margaret River. The time had come to get on with her life, even if it did mean divorcing the man who still consumed 90% of her thoughts. No matter how hard she tried over the last 6 months to forget Cole Jacobs, he still invaded her dreams every night. A clean break was the only way to break the cycle. While still living in a house owned by Cole, her connection to him would always be strong. After she'd asked him for a divorce, she would take off the beautiful wedding set he'd given her and move out of the place that had provided her with sanctuary to heal after the loss she had suffered. While approaching Cole at this charity event may not seem the best way of asking for what she wanted, for her there was safety in numbers. She knew he was conscious of how the public perceived him at events, especially after a woman he had been seeing created a scene at an important business function. Her actions had almost cost him a major account. As this particular charity was one of his family's favorite ones, there was no way he'd do anything to cause a scene and bring unnecessary attention to them. Taking a deep, cleansing breath, she opened the door and exited her room. Hopefully, when she returned, she would have Cole's agreement and she could leave the last year behind her. The noise from the ballroom drifted toward her as she rounded the corner. She timed her arrival for a half hour after the official start time. Not that anyone arrived at these events on time. It was all about creating an entrance for some people. Not her. Ava preferred to slip in with minimal fuss, something that had been impossible to achieve when she and Cole had started dating, and later during the short time they actually lived together after saying their wedding vows. Every time she'd walked into a restaurant or an event similar to this one, she'd felt everyone looking at her, judging her for trying to be something she had no hope of being. Before she started seeing Cole, she'd been a university graduate trying to find a job in the cutthroat event planning world. An unremarkable girl with an unremarkable background. She was so out of her league with Cole. She'd always worried she'd run into an ex-lover of his. She'd seen him in the society pages with beautiful women. How would she ever match up to those women? She wasn't that same girl anymore. Time on her own had made her stronger, able to face any situation head first and not back down from what she wanted or who she'd become. Ava entered the lavishly decorated ballroom, noting the blue and silver tones of the tablecloths and table settings. The lights glowed on the silverware. Women were standing around wearing the finest gowns and the finest jewels, looking like they owned half the city. Some of them probably did. It had a distinct, sophisticated feel about it, and for a moment, all the insecurities she thought she'd overcome hit her with the force of a gale wind. In her off-the-rack gown, she knew she didn't fit in. Her earrings, though beautiful, were no match for what adorned the ears of many women in the room. No matter how strong she thought she'd become, the truth of the matter was she would never be a part of Cole's world. Stepping into this room reinforced her resolve to ask him for a divorce. A waiter carrying a tray of assorted drinks stopped in front of her. She helped herself to a glass of champagne and took a sip. The tartness hit the back of her throat. She took another large swallow, building up the courage to begin looking for Cole. She started a slow walk around the room, hated being partnerless. The last time she'd been alone at one of these events, she'd met Cole. Ava closed her eyes against the memories peppering her brain. How Cole had rescued her from the octopus hands of a drunken guest, All it had taken was one smile and she'd been lost. She should have run that night, run as far away as possible. If she had, she would have saved herself from a world of heartache. Enough, she commanded herself. Over the last few months, she'd done plenty of thinking and planning. After tonight, she would put the plans in motion. Surely Cole would agree that it would be pointless for them to remain married. He would relish having his freedom again. Who knows? Maybe he already had another woman warming his bed. It wouldn't surprise her. Cole had always been a player. The longest he'd stayed with a woman before her had been 3 months. It seemed that 5 months into their relationship, Cole had started to slowly draw away from her, telling her he had to attend more lodge dreiser meetings. She never asked him about his Freemason dealings as much as she wanted to. She'd heard all about the secrecy surrounding the society. What happened behind closed doors had always intrigued her, but she respected the history behind Freemasonry, so she never pressured him to tell her what went on at his meetings. Problem was, she hadn't believed he'd been attending those meetings. Her conviction was that she wasn't enough of a woman to keep Cole interested, ate away at her, undermining the basis of their relationship. Even when they went to functions together, women flirted outrageously around him. Why wouldn't he be tempted? Eventually, she persuaded herself he was cheating on her. Then she'd taken the test that had changed everything. She heard the gossip around the social circles that she trapped him with a baby, that he was only marrying her out of obligation. Cole had assured her that she hadn't trapped him, but he still hadn't told her that he loved her. He told her that he cared deeply for her. She tried to accept that he was the type of guy who didn't express his feelings, couldn't say the words every woman hoped to hear. You shouldn't be standing alone, not at an event like this. Perhaps I can help you find your table? Ava turned and came face to face with a handsome man in a tuxedo. Any other woman would flutter their eyelashes and smile coyly at him. For her, she'd only ever wanted one man in a tuxedo, and this man wasn't him. Thank you, but I'm fine. I'm looking for someone. As far as brush-offs went, it was gentle. Fortunately, this man took the hint. I hope you find whoever it is you're looking for. Ava smiled and turned back to survey the room. The crowd had increased since she had arrived. Trying to find Cole would be even harder now, but she was determined to find him. Whatever it took, she would walk out of this room with his agreement for a divorce. Cole Jacobs listened with one ear as his mother talked to him about the near disaster with the florist. He was missing an important meeting with his friends and fellow Freemasons, Dominic, Jude, and Declan, to be here this evening. They were planning the next move for their charity. Things were heating up and care needed to be taken, so what they hoped to accomplish wasn't exposed. One false move and many lives could be lost. Cole, are you listening to me? He leaned in and kissed his mom on the cheek. She'd been lonely since Dad had passed away 4 months ago. He was glad she had her charities to keep her busy. He worried about her, though, and always made sure she needed him. If she needed him, he was there for her. Sorry, Mom, I've got a few things on my mind. Is she one of them? His spine stiffened when he looked over to where Mom pointed. His elusive wife stood not 10 feet away from him. The woman who hadn't bothered to stand by his side when his father had died. The woman who had walked out when their relationship had hit a troubled patch. The woman who had ignored him, who ignored that he had been hurting as much as she was. What the hell is she doing here? She wasn't invited. Cole, Mom's tone said it all. Sorry. You need to do something about this marriage of yours. It's not healthy to live apart. Cole blew out a frustrated breath. It's a bit difficult when she refuses to speak to me. You should have gone and seen her. Tried harder to communicate with her. Mom looked at him shrewdly. Unless you didn't want to, in case she said something you didn't want to hear. Cole had no plans to let his mom know it suited him to have Ava safely ensconced in his Margaret River property and not someplace else where he couldn't keep her safe. She was far enough away from his and Lodge Dreiser's dealings, but not far enough away he couldn't get to her if he needed to. The less she knew, the safer she would remain. Now he had the added job of dealing with his father's estate and making sure the company continued to be profitable, as well as making sure the transition from his father's management style to his went smoothly. Chasing after Ava got pushed back into his mind. I've been busy over the last couple of months, Mom. No matter how busy your dad was, he always put you and me first. The last thing he needed was a lecture, nor did he want to mention that hadn't always been the case with Dad. Besides, he needed to find out why Ava was at a function where she definitely wasn't on the guest list. I'm sorry to leave you, Mom, but he looked toward where Ava stood. She still hadn't seen him, but he could tell she was looking for someone. Him, perhaps? It's fine. Go. Although, Cole, he turned back to his mom. Yes? I don't know what happened, but remember, she's your wife and where you are. Try not to be the hard-headed person I know you can be. He chuckled. Yes, Mom. He gave her another quick kiss on the cheek and made his way to where Ava stood. Everything he'd felt over the last couple of months bubbled to the surface. He'd expected she would attend his father's funeral. It wasn't like she didn't know when and where it was being held. He'd phoned and left a message for her, hating that he couldn't talk to her, tell her personally. He would have driven down to see her, but he couldn't leave his mom. She'd been devastated when his father died. He'd been worried that she would have an emotional breakdown. He'd been torn between the duty of a son and the duty of a husband. Her non-attendance at the funeral told Cole all he needed to know. It shattered everything he thought he knew about her. Every hope he'd had that they could rebuild what they'd once had between them died the moment his father's coffin had been lowered into the ground. Drawing on the anger and hurt and disappointment he felt that day, Cole walked up behind Ava, unable to stop the memories of the first night he'd met her blasting his brain the closer he got to her. How badly he'd wanted to knock out the guy who had his hands all over her when he could tell Ava wanted nothing to do with the man. How she'd thanked him for rescuing her. He had been captivated by her freshness and innocence from that moment on. Cole tamped down on those thoughts. He couldn't let himself recall that time. It had become the past the moment she devalued their relationship by walking out on him, not trusting him enough to care and look after her. But Ava was here when she hadn't made any attempt to contact him for months. Her making the first move had to mean something, a door opening for them to communicate through. Maybe they could find a way to push past the hurts behind, to put the past hurts behind them and try again. Ava. She whirled around quickly. He took a step back so he didn't get splashed with champagne. He took in the surprise on her face as if she hadn't expected to see him there. He didn't quite believe it. After all this time of hiding away, she showed up at his mom's favorite charity event. No, she wanted something. Excuse me. Finding out what she wanted and getting rid of her with a minimum of fuss was what he needed to do. No matter that seeing her again made his heart beat faster than normal. Her dress clung to her curves, accentuating her luscious breasts. His eyes roved over the face he hadn't seen in months, taking in the way her green eyes glittered brightly. Then he saw them, the earrings, the wedding gift he'd given her, the hope he'd had for their marriage when he'd bought them for her. Cole clenched his fists tightly to stop from reaching out to touch them. He repeated the sentiment he'd uttered when his mom directed his attention to where Ava had been standing. What the hell are you doing here?